Good morning. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. Welcome to the Forum. So great to see all of you here today. I've been looking forward to this very much for a long time. It's the first time that Alan and I have been up here at the same time. Alan Jones on the far side there is on the far right.
Far left.
For you.
Depends on this issue.
That's right. He's neither on the far right nor on the far left. I shouldn't have teased. But Alan is probably one of the most important Episcopal preachers of the 20th and 21st century. When the church no pressure. When the church preaching series came out, the original one, they asked Alan to be the one to write about spirituality. So his books have been nurturing Episcopalians and people outside the Episcopal Church for generations. We're very glad also to have Peter Coyote here. Peter is famous, I think, for so many different things. He was a very active part of the countercultural in the 60s. He was part of the San Francisco Mime Troupe, one of the Diggers, very involved in communal life in California, and then became a film star. I mean, I think you're the only movie star I've ever met.
Well, it's nothing like starting at the bottom.
But even more important than that, Peter has been ordained as a Zen priest. He's a teacher and a practitioner of meditation, and I think he's had decades of experience in that prayer practice. And I think that, too, is probably been an important part of your story. But I was telling Alan we had a fire alarm early this morning. He was there. I said, it is going to be so easy to ask you two questions. You both, believe it or not, share a lot in common. And I thought we might begin by just talking about your ordination, both of you, each of you. Maybe you can describe what led up to your ordination, and then tell us a little bit about the ordination itself.
Oh, thanks a lot. So I began Zen practice in around 1974. I had been a heroin addict for a long time and really done the counterculture. And when that sort of fell apart, I lived on communes for 10 years, I wound up as a single father of a daughter, and my family had lost its money, and I was in serious shape. And I moved into Zen Center Monastery, and I started a course of psychotherapy, really, pretty diligently. And I did that for 2 years, and my therapist died, and I found another guy and went on. And so I was never interested in becoming a priest. I was always interested in lay practice, and I was very judgmental about all the Japanese gift wrapping around Zen Buddhism. I thought there was a American core to wisdom that was being missed. So my teacher, after a dozen years or so, he asked me to take this course that was being done, a 3-year course, kind of an ad hoc divinity school. You met for a weekend a month for 3 years. And they covered all the kind of difficulties and problems of being a cleric. Everything from transference to money to appropriate behavior with women. And so I just said, well, I'm not going to be a priest. He said, I know, but this will help deepen your practice. And so I did this, and I was so impressed by the caliber of the people that I was studying with, who were far more developed than I was. They were all leading groups. Some of them were authors. And by the end, I decided that I really wanted to up my game. And I asked my teacher if I could ordain.
Yeah.
And it's, to cut a long story short, because it takes you almost a year to sew your robes. This is a miniature Buddhist robe, which we wear because you can't work in your regular robes. And it's made out of these panels which represent the paths in a rice paddy. And so you have this thing like a king-size sheet, all these strips that have to be pinned and measured, and you work with a teacher every 10 days or so for a year. Every stitch has a prayer, and it's actually very beautiful and very satisfying work. And then you are ordained, and there's a lot of ritual stuff, but one of the things is they take a lock of your hair or they shave your head, And there's a number of steps in which you renounce kind of householder life. Well, because my teacher and I have a lay practice, we don't exactly renounce householder life. Right. He's married, I was married, but so we take a lock of the hair and take it off. And then you wake up the next, and you're given your robes, and a black robe and a black roxu that I had to sew. And this brown color you get when you've been transmitted, when your teacher frees you from his authority. So I woke up the next day and I was a priest.
Wow.
And there's something about the ceremony that changes you. Yeah. And it took me a couple of years before I really felt like I had grown into it. And now I've been transmitted a few years, and I've just given myself 5 years not to be teaching, just casually, friend to friend, and to settle into that.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I remember being ordained, and I was in my 20s, and these older people I admired so much would kneel before you and ask you to bless them. It was like everything was upside down and backwards.
Exactly.
I mean, I should be being blessed by them, and that's my most vivid memory of it. But what about you, Alan? What led up to it, and what was it like?
Born in London in 1940, working class family, one of the things you could do in England about Christianity was you could go through the whole ecumenical movement without leaving the Church of England. It's peculiar. I used to tell people that Anglicanism is the Zen Buddhism of the West, by which I mean that for us, schism is a greater sin than heresy. In other words, you can have a wide variety of beliefs, but let's keep the unity, let's keep the community together. So I was in a very evangelical church and then became Anglo-Catholic, and it was all in the same denomination. And then there was a sort of romantic side of it, that I ended up in an Anglican monastery to be trained for priesthood. And the message from the monks was, God is madly in love with us. That was it.
That's great.
Simple.
And everything else is a footnote to that. And so I got two things from my parents, contradictory things about life. My dad died when I was 11, but he was a joker. His view of life was, wow, fantastic. And my mum was, when is the bastard going to strike next? So I've had this love affair with God, and yet the big issue is trust and trying to move on. So I became ordained, but I'm a sort of Catholic Christian. But for me, Christianity hasn't happened yet. Right. We're still working on it and trying to live it. And I've come to, that's why I think you and I hit it off. I mean, I think it was like meeting an old friend for the first time. Yeah. In that you keep showing up and trying to open it up, and love is the test. Love is, and the rest are footnotes. I think I've told you that there's only two doctrines. One is everybody matters. The second is we're in this together.
Yeah.
And the rest are footnotes to it. And so you can have sublime theology and still smell a rat, because that person might do me in, And it's not so much for me, what can I know, but who can I trust?
The Dalai Lama said his religion is kindness.
Right, exactly.
It's funny when I hear you speak, because technically or ideologically, the universe for Buddhists is one interdependent thing. And so there's no place outside of it for God to exist, which does not mean that we are atheists at all, but that if anything, our belief in emptiness, which is the kind of formless, pregnant energy underneath all of visible reality that creates solar systems and hummingbirds and people and ashtrays and cities, that energy itself is sacred. And consequently, everything that's created by it, even when we don't like it, it's very difficult for me to realize that Donald Trump is made of the same stuff I am, and that he has an equal right to live, and that he has feelings and experiences that are different than mine. And the reason I'm saying this is because the implication of that is that if we know that we're the same thing, then I can't sit in judgment.
You can't demonize.
That's right. I can't act as if I'm the repository of all good. Right. I mean, it's such a low bar to feel good next to our president. Yeah. So, but
there's nobody who's beyond the pale.
Right. So the truth is, all I can do is realize that you are another manifestation of myself, and to try to figure out what led you to your beliefs. And when I treat you that way, without judgment, you relax, and we can have the beginning of a conversation. And I won't labor it, but I put that to the test 8 years working for Jerry Brown, and became befriended by conservative Republican legislators who I developed relationships with.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, in your book, you'll not even remember this because it's like 700 pages of book right here. But in one of the books, you talk about the light coming in through the teepee door and landing on the altar after kind of a night of peyote experience.
Peyote ceremony.
And you said that there's a way in which, for you at that moment, I mean, you felt this intense sense of the Creator's blessing at that moment. And I wonder just what the role for both of you of religious experiences, those kind of transcendent experiences, and what you have to say about those, both of you. So Alan may start, or Peter, whoever.
Well, that was that old saying, isness is God's business.
Business is God's business.
You have 1 million of them.
Yeah. He's got 1 million. He doesn't stop.
That whole sense is that believing in transcendence within the world, not a kind of complete separation.
Right.
And realizing that you're in the presence of mystery all the time, and that your conclusions about life are always penultimate. They're always provisional. Mm-hmm. And that whole notion of realizing that, what we have in our culture is malice masquerading as self-righteousness. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to sort of have any kind of conversation. So for me, I love that retranslation of the opening of the fourth gospel, is in the beginning was the conversation.
Right.
And that conversation was with God, and that conversation entered into our flesh. And to be human is to be in communion with each other and available to each other, and that's the sort of mystical or the sense of the sacred, and being kind. I mean, that's what Aldous Huxley, oh Lord, he was being driven to the airport. Thank you.
Houston
Smith, when he was younger, driving Aldous Huxley to the airport, I think in Syracuse or somewhere, and he had the cheek to ask Aldous Huxley, do you have any regrets? And Huxley said, yes, I wish I'd been more kind. Uh-huh. And that hit me a great deal, about that sense of kindness, which introduces us to the sense of transcendence and the sacred. Right. And always living within that availability to mystery, which then rescues you from demonizing and a kind of destructive anger. It doesn't take away your distress or even outrage at certain things, but it stops it becoming a vehicle of the ego.
Yeah, a toxin.
A toxic thing, yeah. Yes.
So I'd like to actually ask both of you. I have the feeling that we all came to the priesthood on a very, very long path, that somewhere in your childhood you had some experience that told you that life was magical or things were special, and that as you, like when I discovered Buddhism, I discovered a description of the world that described experiences I had already had.
Right.
So even in the 60s, when I was taking tons of acid and drugs and seeking some way of expressing the way I felt about the world, it was a very archaic and ancient experience. Mm-hmm. And that when you settle into some kind of a spiritual life, you've matured to where you can give it form and you can give it some kind of control. But I can remember being about 4 years old and seeing a robin that looked like it was outlined in jet black ink, and it was so vivid and so stood out from the background that it was magical.
Yeah.
And from that, I started looking at lots of things as magic. And then, I was able to subsume that wonder and magic under a lot of drugs and excess, but it was always there, like a drone note in the bagpipe. Yeah. And so I'm curious if either of you had some seminal experience like that when you were very young that made you different from everybody else that didn't have that experience.
Right. Yeah, and I remember waking up one morning and being the first one out and it being dark out and watching the sunrise and just hearing this voice in my heart just saying, everything, all of this is created. And it was just overwhelming emotional response to it.
How old were you?
I was in middle school.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But you're right. Small childhood experiences are like that too. Just being out in the snow, being the first one up, and the hills just covered with whiteness, and it's silent, and the whole auditory world has changed because the snow is muffling everything. And it's funny because the church has always been part of my life, so it's always been woven into that. So it's almost like I can't imagine experiencing this beautiful sunset without the church, or the church without the sunset. Uh-huh. They're all kind of all woven together. Yeah. How about you, Alan?
My family wasn't church going. In fact, my grandmother thought all priests and doctors were rogues. And when she heard I was going to be a priest, she said, not piously, I hope to Christ he's not. Thank you, grandmother. So it was a bit sort of form of rebellion, but I can remember very vividly, still can, 6 years old, on Wimbledon Common, which was this sort of parkland near where we lived, of looking at a tree and realizing a tree had its existence. It was a kind of wonder that there was this thing.
Right.
And it never lost me. I never lost it. That sense of extreme wonder at there is, that whole thing. Why is there anything at all and not just nothing? The way that was sustained, and I was about 6.
Yeah, Annie Dillard writes in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek about seeing the light through the leaves of a tree.
Same idea.
Yeah.
I think everyone's had that. I was on a plane flight once with a Polish man who was Einstein's secretary. Yeah. And he told me that when Einstein wrote the unified field theory, he was revising it one day and a beetle flew onto the paper. And he looked at the beetle and he later withheld the publication of unified field theory for 2 or 3 years because he said to his secretary, I haven't the faintest idea what this beetle is or how it came to be. How dare I reduce the universe to a single equation?
Right.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
That's great.
Yeah.
One of the things we mentioned earlier that you share in common is acting and a love of theater. I wonder maybe if you can talk a little bit about what it meant to you when you first started. You write about like life acting, breaking the glass. Just how does acting kind of transform us as a society? And then when I go to the play, to the theater these days, I don't know if you feel this too, but the age of the people I'm going to the theater with is advanced. I'm just not seeing very many younger people who are drawn to the theaters that I'm going to. Maybe I'm just going to the wrong places, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that too.
One thing is part of 5 things about Buddhism which I like, but the one is the first aphorism is life is not about you. And that might sound very negative, but it's such a relief.
Oh, yeah.
And to know that there's a drama going on other than your own psychodrama. So my quick story is I was in a very strange support group with Ram Dass, who I was deeply fond of. And it was my turn to present, and this place wasn't built. There was a big hole in the parking lot. We hadn't raised the money. And I went on and on and on. It was my turn to sort of say where I was. And Ram Dass, at the end of my pouring out this, grinned at me and said, Alan, enjoyed the play. And it was a very helpful thing to ask yourself, whatever you're doing, ask yourself, what play am I in? Mm-hmm. And it gives you a certain detachment. It's not being phony, it's not being unreal, but it's realizing that there are dramas and things going on other than your own. It's sort of a little escape out of narcissism, so that you're part of, and that why to go and be in a play and take on another role is to be liberated into a much bigger world.
Yeah.
I think exactly that. Do you know this lovely book, The Four Agreements?
No, I don't.
By Manuel Ruiz. He's a Yaqui shaman. And one of the first chapters is that nothing's personal.
Yeah.
That even if somebody's pointing at you and yelling at you, he's reading off a script in his mind. He's made all these assumptions about who's before him. So to me, the thing about acting was the sheer play of it. I work with masks a lot. I started in the San Francisco Mime Troupe with masks, and then I developed these exercises that I take around the country to Zen centers, where I get people in masks and I hold a mirror up to them, and the new face actually eradicates their identity for a short time, and someone else comes in, a holographic.
We had the mime troupe here several times years ago,
So a whole holographic identity comes in, and you can question them, and they know all this stuff. So I call that enlightenment light. And I'm trying to tease people into the practice of meditation. But for me, it's exactly that. You're always using yourself, but when you're behind the mask of another character, somehow that mask gets you out of your own way.
Right.
And the forbidden is permissible, and you can emphasize different qualities which you couldn't in everyday life, and it's just the play of the human mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the sad things about the shooting. I remember reading about the shootings in Columbine years ago. Remember when? And those kids they didn't have any art or creativity. They had nothing to help them negotiate their craziness. You know? And how do you do that? I hope we're going to get to the summer of love, because
We can't miss that
because
out.
Peter and I have got to be able to disagree.
But I can't. So what about the future? I mean, like I said, I go to the theater, and I just don't know if you have something more to say about what's happening in theater, or a bigger picture of, is theater going to still have the same power that it did in 1965?
I think that I think time is always moving in multiple directions. We tend to think of it like a spool of thread going into a pool of black ink. But I actually think it's not, time goes from now backwards. And all of our ideas about the future are just ideas. And they're always bifurcated. So at the same time that electric music is dominant, all of a sudden unplugged music becomes important. At the same time that digital cameras take over everything, people are starting to get out their Leicas and film again. At the same time, fast food is dominant, slow food is becoming. So I think there's always going to be the wonder of human beings doing something in the present moment, where anything can happen.
Right.
You know that in a film there's not going to be any accident. They've all been scrubbed out. But on stage or in a live performance, there's always the possibility of an accident. And I think one of the things we use art for is to find the parameters of being human. So when we see other human beings and we see them, they show us without artifice. They set the new levels. And I don't think that's ever going to go away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I look at it like Greek tragedy and what it shows us, and even those stories there's just a deep part of us, even today, thousands of years later. But it's almost like theater for you is almost like a doorway through which you entered the 60s. I mean, you left Grinnell College and then you arrived in San Francisco. You were enrolled at San Francisco State, and then you started with the San Francisco Mime Troupe. And I wonder just if that entry changed your experience of what the 60s was like, or would have been just the same if you'd entered through another way.
No, well, I was an actor in college.
Yeah.
We had I was part of the black turtleneck sweater, camel cigarette crowd.
Yeah, I like that. That's cool.
We were all writers and poets. And one day, this wonderful guy, Ned Donahoe, who was just an outrageously talented drunk, his parents were the warders of an insane asylum, and he had grown up with the inmates as his playmates.
Yes.
He had an absolutely fluid sense. He dropped into the student union in my cadre, and he said to me, I suppose you have no idea that theater is an argument of great moment danced before the public.
Of course.
And I said, no. He said, well, if you had any balls, you'd come and you'd try out for my theater. And so I did.
Right.
And he put together a little rep company in the theater. He said, well, the basketball coach always uses his best. Why should I have to work with dimwits? So he put together this little company, and we did play after play after play after play for 4 years. And I could stand off stage behind him, watching his actors, and just by watching the movements of his body, you could see the emotional beat of every character. And so he opened my mind to the vastness of theater. And then I came out here and I was in the actors' workshop for a while. That was moribund. And I saw the mime troupe.
Right.
And there was this incredible vitality. And incidentally, the two most beautiful women I had ever seen. Yeah. And so I auditioned there the next day. And they also gave me lots of freedom, as much rope as I could take. But then these people, Emmett Grogan and Billy Murcott from New York, came and they said, you know, you're playing it safe. And everyone thought the mime troupe was right on the edge of risk. We improvised everything. A drunk would get up on the stage and we'd play with him, dance with him right off the edge of the stage. But they said, you always know the script. You can always break the form and you can always come back. Why don't we take our improvisatory skills and create theater pieces that people won't know are theater, that will change the way they think about reality. So when we created the free store, in which we had tools, clothing, music, everything in working order, but last year's stuff that people were giving away, the roles in the store were clear. You could come into the store and say, who's in charge here? We'd say, you are.
Yeah, right. And then you're the manager.
And if you just looked at me stupidly, there's no point in blaming the pigs or the man or the system. You'd been offered a gift and you'd drop it. But if you said, oh, really, I'm in charge? Well, I hate the way these shirts are done, so let's change this. And so we were raising the question, why become an employee to make the money to become a consumer? We'll give you the stuff for nothing. Now what are you going to do with your life? And we ran this for several years. And same thing with... we had doctors coming down on Wednesdays from UC Med Center to do free medicine. Okay, now you have free medicine. So we wanted to imagine a future and then make it real by acting it out. And so we just expanded our sense of what art was. You could say the Diggers were a 3-year art project, but designed to seduce people into an understanding of reality. We knew that Americans were not going to throw themselves on the barricade to be the lumpen proletariat. But if they found a life that they loved, they might defend it.
And what worked the best about that process, and what was, didn't work so well?
Well, what didn't work is that we were so busy being heroes that we didn't really develop lives. We didn't have very developed interpersonal skills. So if you wake up in the morning and I go to wash my face in the sink and my friend, my brother Kent, has just cleaned a transmission in the sink and it's a black grease pit. There's no ideological revolutionary ideology that can say, I gotta have a clean sink in the morning. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Or free love is wonderful until it's your girlfriend that doesn't come home.
Right, exactly.
And and then it's like murder over the orange juice. So unfortunately, we brought all of our baggage and unresolved issues, and we didn't really
work it through.
Yeah, we didn't really work them through. And a lot of the lubrication was drugs.
It's interesting that the set book, when I taught Introduction to Spirituality in New York, I only had one required text. And it was Peter Brook's The Empty Space.
Oh, yeah,
I read that.
Which is all about acting, about the theater. Because I wanted them to sort of look at it in a radically different way. That book, by the way, if you haven't read it, came out in the 60s. The Empty Space by Peter Brook is still a key
brilliant.
text.
It's a great book.
Text
It's a great book.
About that,
And so, Alan, what did the 60s look like from where you were? I mean, like, I don't-
Horrible.
Oh, say what you feel.
What a rip-off. No, I mean, I put it in the context of my own experience. My first visit, I came to America in '64 to be on a scholarship to be a senior at General Seminary in Manhattan. And I'd come from an Anglican monastery to Manhattan, and it seemed so corrupt already, and it was very conservative. I mean, my roommate had a bottle of scotch, he had a phone, he had a television. I mean, God, what a hopeless thing.
God, he could have had a woman.
He didn't even have a woman. And then, but we drove across the country and went to Berkeley in the summer of '65. So I saw that kind of thing. And then when I came back, that whole notion of the summer of love and all that, then I came back to be dean of the cathedral and lived on Ashbury Street. And that was 84, 85.
Oh, yeah.
Where I saw people who'd been in Berkeley, or rather in the Haight-Ashbury in the 60s, who'd fried their brains. And I got very upset about romanticizing the 60s, because you know, that whole thing, I think it was Chris Matthews who said on television this week, if you hated the 60s, you're a Republican, and if you love the 60s, you're a Democrat. Wrong, because I suppose it's maybe my Englishness and Anglicanism is that I have a passion for moderation. I'm passionately
It's the
moderate.
Englishness.
In that if you go too far one way, you always have the reaction. And so it's a real struggle. I don't mean I do it very well, but to sort of maintain that middle ground, the via media, we call it the via regia, the royal way, of how you do that. And that's, I think, why I resonate with your journey, in that you come through all that kind of darkness and mess and struggle and glory and creativity to a place of centeredness. And it doesn't mean that it's perfection, far from it, but you're on this sort of open adventure. And so I think I was deeply disappointed by the 60s, because it had such hope. It's rather like people ask, are you conservative or liberal? I said, well, as some of you have heard me say this before, I'm a what do I say I am?
Very lovely man.
I'm a lovely man. In that
Yeah, you're
that
conservative in some aspects of your life, and you're
It
liberal
depends
in
what
other
the
aspects.
subject-
Yeah, so if you're
depends.
talking about immigration policies, that's different than if you're
I'm
talking.
a progressive traditionalist.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what I'd like to think, so that we're part of this long, great tradition, and to be sort of participate in that. And so it depends on the topic. I can remember going down, for Occupy Wall Street and talking to the people and being very sympathetic and being so grateful they weren't in charge.
That they weren't
God,
the chair of the Fed.
Please, really. So it was. So I'm very conflicted politically. When I joined, when I was a student, I joined the National Association of Socialist Students and went to my first meeting, and a spotty-faced woman called Pat Frid called me comrade, and I never went back. And then I joined the Labour Party as a young priest in England. I went down to have a drink of beer with the workers, and they were worried about the niggers and the Pakis taking their jobs.
Yeah.
They were racist, horrible, as well as anyone else.
Wogs start at Calais.
Exactly, the Wogs begin at Calais, right. So there was that sort of prejudice. And so finding, as you said, when you work for Jerry Brown, that you find allies in all sorts of places who have a gracious spirit that might not fit in with your ideology. And to have that openness is, to me, very important.
I have a great aphorism, great Buddhist aphorism about that. A wood Buddha cannot go through a fire.
Yeah,
A brass Buddha cannot go through a furnace. And a clay Buddha cannot go through water. And what it means is that no fixed idea will work in every situation.
Right.
You can't be always liberal or always conservative or always anything, because there are going to be some circumstances where it's not going to work. And you have to be willing to abandon that position and be in the moment and read the facts. I would like to say one thing about the 60s, although I do agree with you. There were costs to our experiments, and the costs were high. Between 1965 and 75, I buried 18 of my closest friends who died from either murders or drug overdoses or swallowing the evidence that opened up in their stomachs and killed them. It's fair to say that we lost every political battle. That we didn't end racism, we didn't end war, we didn't end neoliberalism, we didn't end capitalism, we didn't end, a host of things. But if you look on the cultural front, we won everything. There's no place today where you can't go in the United States and find organic food and a slow food movement. There's no place you can't go and find a women's movement. There's no place you can't go and find an environmental movement that's defending some creek or watershed or something. There's no place where you can't find alternative religious practices. Jainism, Tibetan Buddhism, Vipassana,
Yoga.
Hinduism, yoga. There's no place where you can't find alternative medical practices, homeopathy, naturopathy, acupuncture. And those are the deep waters where people are actually living their lives. The ideas and the politics is the frothy whitewater, no pun intended, where things change every moment. The Diggers were cultural revolutionaries. And although we made terrible mistakes and they were very costly and we, had all the arrogance of 20-something-year-olds, when you look back at the contributions of the 60s, I think they were deeper, more valuable changes than had we not been here.
Yeah. We've been through tremendous, women weren't ordained in the Episcopal Church in the 60s. Just that one thing is a major change. And it's hard to even describe to our children.
Gender tolerance.
Yeah, completely.
Think about gay weddings, how soon that, how short time ago that became.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Completely. One of the things that's most powerful to me about your story is just living in those communal places, in Olima and in Turkey Ridge, and just what did you learn as kind of in your more leadership role, and then what do you miss about it, and then what do you think say nuclear families could learn about living together in those ways? Because I don't know where that is. That experiment is still continuing on for many families and people. I just wonder what you have to say about what that felt like.
Well, I will say that had I been able to get free education for my children and health benefits, I'd probably still be living on a commune. Because it was delicious to have brothers and sisters to work with every day, to have lots of mothers to help parcel out the tensions and difficulties of parenting. If you were sick, another mother would just fold your kids in. It was very, even though for 10 years I never made $2,500 a year, it was still very stress-free. I wasn't exactly a leader. The Diggers were a leaderless community. But, I was one of the old-timers.
Yeah, there's an informal authority that you have.
So I had a certain amount of it.
Yeah.
I miss that still. I'm still in touch. We have 108 people on an email chain, and we're all chipping in money to support about 12 of our indigent friends who got old and are poor. It's no fun. So I do miss that. I don't miss the chaos. I don't miss the endless debates about the everything.
Right.
Right, exactly. I came in one day and the bathroom door had been taken off.
I read about that. That was my favorite part.
Because privacy is a bourgeois concern.
Exactly.
Give me a break. So, and there were things like, so for once I was on a commune and somehow the subject of incest came up, and this very angry woman said to me, well, what's so wrong with incest? And it actually threw me back on my heels, and I had to come up with an answer.
Right.
So that was a positive side of it, and I did. I'll tell you my answer because I'm proud of it. I was the father of a daughter, and I said, well, I have a very pretty daughter, and she's blonde. She's going to get a lot of male attention in her life. She ought to have one island that's free of sexual tension and conflict.
Great.
Yeah. So the other great line I had was when my daughter came home at 16, she was in boarding school and she wanted a Porsche. And I had to stop and thank you, God. I was inspired to say, I will never buy you a car your teacher couldn't afford.
That's good. That was a great answer. But speaking of that, I mean, you both are parents, and I wonder just kind of what your parenting philosophy is and how that's changed. I mean, now that you're at a more grandparent generation. Heck, I'm grandparent generation.
There's a book that has a very comforting chapter in it called The Parental Fallacy. And I don't know whether it's true, but it's very comforting. James Hillman wrote it.
Oh, yeah.
And the parental fallacy is that we have far less influence over our children than we think, that they're on a trajectory of their own freedom, and the real problem is that we need to get out of the way. I don't know whether it's true, but I've found it when I think of my own 3 children who are fantastic, articulate, caring, creative people.
In spite of us.
In spite of them.
Well, that's very modest. But I think of your dad. I mean, it has had an enormous impact on.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I feel like he's kind of present when I see you. Even. I mean, all those stories about his larger than life person, and your mom too. I mean,
Took me 2 books to deal with them.
Completely.
So I have one thing to share, which is when my daughter thinks I was a great parent, even as a single parent, and even
I'm
through
glad. I'm
2
really glad to
wicked
hear that.
stepmothers.
Yeah.
She adores me.
Yeah.
My son's a little dodgier. We're very close, but I can wrong foot it easily.
Yeah.
But I was saved by somebody giving me the information I'm going to pass on to this room. There's a website called the Love and Logic Institute, and they make these very funny CDs about parenting, which are so helpful. And it steered me through my children's adolescence.
Yeah.
What they say is that all adolescents are riven by an absolute dichotomy, 2 impulses that are going in separate directions. One is they want to be left completely alone, and the other is they want to continue to be indulged.
Right.
And
So one moment they're like a 10-year-old, and the next moment they're like a 40-year-old.
and they'd rather fight than stay on the horns of that dilemma.
Yeah.
So they teach you how to make the fight theirs and how to stay out of the way. So I'll give you an example. So when my daughter came upstairs dressed like a prostitute to go out,
Right.
I
That
resisted.
sounds so funny.
I resisted the impulse to grab her by the back of the neck and take a broom and brush her down in the shower. And so, because I had listened to these tapes, I said, "Wow, honey, I'm so glad it's you that's dressed that way." And that stopped her cold, and she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, it's a very sexually provocative way to dress, but you can handle it. You may get tired of a lot of the male attention coming in." So I'd given her a compliment. I managed to say exactly what I wanted to say, all under the tutelage of these people. So when my son came out and to watch TV, and I just asked him if he'd done his homework, and he said, "You're always on me about my homework. I'll get my homework done." I had heard the CD, and I could say, "Honey, no, I don't care. 9th grade will be there next year."
Don't worry.
You're in school for yourself, honey. You're not just going.
Exactly.
Back in the room he went. So the Love and Logic Institute. If I can do it, anyone can do it. Because I came from a family of sociopaths. I had no modeling.
Right, completely.
Yeah.
That's not what you grew up with at all.
Absolutely not.
You mentioned a little bit just working in Jerry Brown's administration. I wonder, just like what that was like, just going from one political world to that other political world. And Alan, you've always been involved in political systems too, so you may have ideas about what make things work when you're trying to do very complicated tasks with very different people who have very different interests.
Well, one of the big influences in my life was the poet Gary Snyder.
Yeah.
And when he won the Pulitzer Prize, Jerry Brown, asked him to organize an arts council of working artists. And Gary and I had known each other for a long time. He liked the way I worked politically and thought. He asked me to join.
Yeah.
And the second year, I was elected chairman.
Yeah.
And I immediately ground things to a standstill by being rude, intolerant, outspoken, and insulting, because I thought I had labored all these years in the counterculture,
Right.
and my people were the people that never got a nickel.
Yeah.
When the San Francisco Mime Troupe was on the cover of the Chamber of Commerce, we couldn't get a cent from the hotel tax fund. So I just told the opera, symphony, and ballet and stuff, they'd had theirs, and now it was the people, up with the people. And in about 6 months, I had paralyzed the state. I had divided it between the people who were all on my side and had no money and no power, and the wealthy people that were on the boards of all these institutions that just told the legislature, forget these guys. So my closest friend on the council he was a very conservative Republican man named Carney Hodge, the only non-working artist. And one day he said to me, you know, we're doing all this crap for $1 million for the state. He said, Jerry Brown's your guy. Why don't you ask him to put $20 million in that we have something to fight for? So Gary and I went to Jerry and we said, just put the money in your budget. You don't have to lift a finger. If we can't win it, you can tell your rich friends you tried. So we did it. And so then I had to go around and I had to eat crow and I had to apologize to all these groups. And I said, look, here's the budget. The major institutions will get 10% of this budget. They didn't know I was holding them to 10% of it, which raised their grants from like 2,000 to 200,000. And I went around and we put all these different mules in harness. And the year that Prop 13 passed, every state took a 10% cut. My budget went from 1 to 5 million, and the next year to 8, and the next to 11, and it was finally 18 with federal money when I left. And what I learned was to listen to people. And what I learned from Jerry Brown was, in a democracy, all boats float or all boats sink. You can't play favorites.
So increasing the size of that pie is what...
So everybody who pays taxes has a right to have their culture expressed. And once I got that, I just had to grow up and change my intolerance and do what I said earlier about listen to people and realize they're me. And I went and talked, one quick story, I went and I talked to these Republicans about hunting and dogs and this and that. And in short order, they were overriding the legislative analyst who was trying to cut my budget, giving me the budget I asked for, and then voting against me on the record to protect themselves. And my last finance hearing, I went up and there were the 3 Mount Rushmore conservatives of California, and they were sitting there and they were looking at me and I'm looking at them. And just before they began to speak, they whipped out hippie headbands and put them on their head to say goodbye. And it was actually very moving.
That is moving.
It can happen.
So we have a tradition at Grace Cathedral, and that is we have the little note cards on your seat. And so if you have a question, write the question down on the note card. And people who have good handwriting have a special edge, I'm afraid. But Rebecca will be collecting those. I mean, both of you went through a major change in the mid-'80s. I mean, so Alan was a professor in New York City, a religion professor, and you went from being part of the Brown administration, and you both began new careers, you as an actor and you as the Dean of Grace Cathedral, and they're really different than what you were doing before. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what that transition was like, what you had to learn that was new. What was that experience like? I'm totally curious about you, Alan. I just never even asked you this before. I should have.
Well, becoming dean here, it was just like coming home, actually. I mean, I used to call chapter meetings, senior staff meetings, faculty meetings for the first month or two. And there was a sort of sigh when I asked the chapter meeting, the senior staff meeting, for a vote. And they all collapsed in laughter, saying they'd never been asked for a vote before because... we used to run the cathedral like a plantation. And I came from an academic background, but I wasn't a very good academic. I mean, I think I'm a good apologist, but I'm not a really scholarly type. I mean, I can write papers with footnotes and things, but so coming here for the variety of relationship and having experienced English cathedrals and what it was to be this cathedral in this city at that particular time with the AIDS epidemic and the crisis. I remember one salient incident in the Chapel of Grace. I was in my full robes in the cassock, and we were going over to say morning prayer, and there was a young man at the back of the chapel crying, kneeling, and I went up to him, and he saw me, and he flinched when he saw me. And he said, "It's all right, I know I don't belong here, I'm going. And I calmed him down, and I said, "Of course you can stay." And he said, "Would you pray with me?" And we went to the altar rail, and he'd just been diagnosed with AIDS, but he thought he wouldn't be welcome here because so many people had been rejected by their community or their church in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
And we were his family, and he
So
lived and
sad.
died with us.
Right.
But the fact that the church communicated that, and I had to sort of tell him that he was welcome, was a very crucial turning point for me.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole country saw you doing that and saw that it was okay to have heart and to be kind.
And it had nothing to do with being conservative or liberal.
Yeah.
It had to do with responding to human need as it was presented to.
Yeah.
And so that was a very key conversion point for me, because you couldn't have the hierarchy as it used to be, because you needed, if you were going to minister to people, you had to have everyone as ministry, so that the congregation found their own ministry too. It was wonderful people in the congregation who went to see AIDS patients every day.
Yeah.
And they were their family. It was a very, very powerful conversion, I'd say. For me. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. How about you, Peter? I mean, what was it
I'm
like?
just overwhelmed by the isolation and loneliness of that person. Just thinking of,
And that he wouldn't be welcome.
yeah, just how. Well, I had a break with the Diggers. After I went to Zen Center, about 2 or 3, I was seeing a woman that I later married, and we were going to have one of our big Digger winter solstice parties. And true to Zen Center form, we got a table and tablecloth, and my girlfriend had worked at Chez Panisse as a sous chef, and she made this Russian kublyaka, which was a crust-covered dish of salmon and rice and herbs, and she had cut out deer and birds and the winter moon, and we had plastic wine glasses. We made this beautiful thing outdoors in the park. And there was a guy that I knew who lived with us for a long time. His name was Samurai Bob, ex-Marine, very anarchic, angry. And when we set all this up, he walked up to the table and he shoved his hand into the middle of this thing and just grabbed out a bunch of stuff and threw it on his plate. And within about 10 minutes, it was wino tom-tom land. Things were knocked over, and I looked at this and I thought, there's nothing about this that reflects my spiritual belief in the order and grandeur of the universe. And so I was sort of cut free, and I had, from there I had gone to Wall Street for a year, all these weird violations of the Digger ethos. So that I knew there were a lot of people that would be upset when I went to work for Jerry Brown.
Yeah.
But it was my success at that. It was a really big success on the big board that gave me the confidence to say, and I was broke.
Yeah.
I had a
Yeah,
child.
right, exactly.
Well, maybe I'll try the movies. I'll give myself 5 years to try it. Anyone could have a bad year. And I got lucky.
Yeah.
And, I spent about 25 or 30 years overpaid. And I got my kids through graduate school without debt. And as soon as that was done, I kind of left because it was not where I lived. Where I lived, I was a writer who made his living as an actor. And, so, I adjusted to that world, but I started late. I was 40 when I got my union card. So I had about an 8 or 9 year window where I left leading man roles, and then I became a character actor. And then the last 10 or 15 years, every role I seemed to play was a shithead in a suit.
Yeah.
If you wanted a corrupt politician, let's get Peter Coyote. Corrupt president, Peter Coyote. Corrupt politician. I mean, it was just, I looked at myself in the mirror and I think, what is it about this? I mean, why does this say shithead in a suit? And so it stopped being interesting, and so I didn't need as much money anymore, and I just stopped.
Do you think it was, different being a film star when you came to it as a 39 or 40-year-old than it would have
Of
been?
course.
Yeah.
I had already lived a life.
Yeah.
I was too experienced to buy my own poster.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, you know.
Yeah, good.
And so I lived in San Francisco. I didn't have a publicist. I didn't do the things that you would do if you were serious about being a star.
Yeah.
I was serious about being a Zen Buddhist. And I felt I was going to be off stage much more time than I was going to be on stage. I better take care of the off stage life,
Right, right.
which came with age
Yeah.
and knowledge. So yeah, that was a big difference.
All right, let's look at some of the questions. When you were given your first voiceover gig, did you think your voice was good enough? Do you like hearing the sound of your voice? Both of you guys have had voiceover gigs, haven't you? Alan's recorded things.
That's such a tricky question.
I like the sound of
I
your
feel
voice.
like if I answer it in more than 3 words, I'm pinned as vain and, you know.
Yeah.
I-
It's a trick question.
It says,
Yeah.
it's not. It's a beautiful one. At the very bottom it says, do you like hearing the sound of your voice? I know we all do, capitalized all, do with exclamation points that have hearts on the bottom of the exclamation points. So
In that case,
in that case, yes.
yes.
So I actually have my mother's voice. My mother lived in her own film noir. She called everyone darling. She smoked, you know, Viceroys. Lovely to see you, darling. She named me Peter because she heard Betty Davis say it in a movie once. I thought it was impossibly elegant. She had a kind of North Atlantic. So I have that voice. But what I really can do is I can read, and I can take you through a complex sentence with lots of appositional phrases and thread you through it so you never lose the track. So my voice doesn't sound to me like it sounds to you. I don't know what values you attribute to it. So I was doing voiceovers before I was acting. When I came back to San Francisco and I needed a way to make a living, I made this little CD of myself in about 15 voices, all talking about what a horrible person Peter Coyote was. You know, Peter Coyote, I wouldn't put him in a room with a woman. He'd jump on her like a kangaroo. He's terrible. And I sent it to every advertising agency in San Francisco, and I started to get voiceover gigs at like $1,500 a session.
Wow.
To a guy who, you know,
Didn't make $2,500 for all those
yeah,
years.
when I made my first film role, I went out and I bought 2 top-of-the-line sleeping bags because I didn't know how long it was going to last. So I'm grateful for my voiceover career because I can go 5 minutes from my house. I get to do all these wonderful Ken Burns things, and I get to give help to lots of documentary films, which by my having 2 Emmys and putting my voice on it, gives them a little edge in getting
great.
seen.
How about you, Alan? I mean, I've heard you recorded like for the Christmas.
I did Dickens' A Christmas
Yeah,
Carol,
yeah.
and Brother Heinrich for the Christmas concert. But I enjoyed that. I did a lot of acting at university.
Yeah.
And think of the liturgy as a great drama, and you know. And
I feel like we need acting lessons. All the clergy I
Yes,
know.
but you've got to do it in such a way that you know. You've got to act in such a way that people don't think you're acting.
Right, exactly.
So it's quite.
You know, if I confess that had I not been 40, had I been serious about being an actor, I would have gone back to London to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, which produces the best English-speaking actors
I thought about going.
for my money. And I actually have an alter ego. When I used to be on the TV sets and I was just bored out of my mind, I have this character, Nigel Dawson, world's most popular actor. Talent is fleeting, but popularity is forever. And by the time the film was done, everybody would have some phony shit-lip lord name, world's most famous cameraman. And I worked with, do you know who Alfred Molina is,
Yeah,
the artist?
great actor.
Well, we worked together doing a season of Law and Order. And we had so much fun because he would leap out on days and he would say, Nigel, with your fame and popularity, why was there no knighthood in your past? And I'd say, well, there was an unfortunate incident with a Boy Scout. Nigel was a gay English fascist who left England after Margaret Thatcher died because the Americans knew how to do things. Anyway, if you have an English accent, you can read the Yellow Pages and people will listen.
Exactly.
So true.
What do you think could be the new summer of love for our current time?
The new summer of love for our current time.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's a good
It's
question.
called American culture because the Summer of Love was actually a branding exercise invented by the Haight-Ashbury merchants to create a national archetype for the Haight-Ashbury so they could sell hash pipes and beads and clothes. And so that's what America has become, is a branding exercise. It's my cynical view.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's the absence of culture, not even with a high capital C,
Yeah.
of being able to have a row, a conversation. I miss having a good argument with people. And I'd love the idea of having an engagement, and through that argument, I actually change my mind.
Yeah.
You know, and we're kind of so polarized that it's a very sad thing when the public conversation has got so toxic.
Yeah, yeah. Here's another question. This is for Peter, I think, but it could, I don't know. You have had a remarkably full life, and it sounds like you have moved into contemplation. Please talk about your insights during your time with 2 dogs and 40 fruit trees, quiet or loud aha moments.
Well, I told you that after I received transmission, I've just been laying low. And I'm living on this farm. It's an hour and something from San Francisco, so I almost never come south. It's, Alan's magnetism drew me here. I have these 40 trees. I make a lot of jam. I have these 2 dogs that are my hot water bottles. And I grew up on a farm, and it's lovely finding myself on a farm with endless projects. I'll have work to do till I die. And if I were really on the one all the time, every next breath would be an aha moment. I'm not quite that evolved, but the state at which I like to be in is the state at which my ideas and my interior dialogue are not blocking my perception of the present, so that it's like, and you can actually drop language away for short periods of time and perceive things as they actually are.
Mm. You do.
Is Buddha? It said Buddhism is about nothing, Christianity is about everything. Is there a marriage here?
Well, Buddhism isn't about nothing. That's a misnomer. Imagine here's a metaphor. Imagine you were standing on a cliff and you were looking at a choppy ocean, lots of little wavelets rising and falling. Each of those wavelets could be something in the universe that's nameable. Mm-hmm. People, dolphins, trees, continents, solar systems, it doesn't matter. They rise up into form for a while and they disappear. And what they forget and what we forget is that they've never not been part of the ocean. So for Buddhists, the ocean is emptiness, is formlessness. It doesn't mean nothing. It means formlessness is only visible through its expression as form. But not to know that there's a common denominator, not to know that there's a vast formless energy field, makes you lost in a world of particulars.
Right, and attached, basically.
The trick is to be able to see the particulars and at the same time to remember that they're all just expressions of emptiness. Mm-hmm. But emptiness is not nothingness, it's formlessness.
Right.
And to me, that sounds deeply Christian in terms of the mystical life. E.M. Forster said bitterly, poor little talkative Christianity, always yakking.
I love Forster.
and that whole notion that that silence, it's supposed to be the phrase of St. Francis of Assisi, preach the gospel to every creature. And if you must, use words.
Yeah.
That whole notion of silence and then shaping the silence is deeply important. And we've lost a lot of that mystical tradition in Christianity, I think.
Yeah.
And it becomes a kind of argument rather than a sense of adoration and wonder. And it gets us into a lot of trouble.
You know, I love St. Francis, and my Zendo, the little room where I practice in, is called Wild Dog Zendo. And many years ago, I was in Alaska, and I was at a native clearinghouse where they sell their pelts and skins, and I walked into a room which to me was like Auschwitz. It was piled high with polar bear skins and wolves and foxes and every beautiful kind of animal. And I spoke to the guys, and they said, well, we've been doing this for 15,000 years. We don't hunt in the spring where their babies are born. We don't deplete our bank account. We don't take too much. And I bought 2 wolf skins and 6 fox skins, which I brought home and I blessed in cedar smoke, and I hung with malas, are these little beads that you'll see people wear. So they're actually hanging in my Zendo with malas around their necks on either side of the altar. And when the Japanese chant, and they use a little wooden drum, and I didn't have one, I didn't want to buy it. So I have a little plain Indian drum, and I have a rattle, which an old Hopi man said to me, if you can tell me what this is, it had little dots drilled in it on both sides. He said, if you can tell me what this is, you can have it. And I held it up to my eye, and I said, it's the Big Dipper. And I turned, which is tattooed on my chest. And I turned it around, I said, it's the Pleiades. So I have this wonderful rattle and this drum that I chant with in the mornings, and I feel like, and an eagle feather, and I feel like I'm actually chanting with all of nature.
Right.
Not just the human realm, but the animal.
So many times you talk about important dreams, almost encounters with animals in your dreams.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's still part of your piety, or are you
Without a
still having
doubt.
dreams? Yeah.
I know what my dogs are thinking. They can look at me,
Yeah,
and I know if they want water, if they want to go out, if they want to play, there's some problem. Because Gary Snyder suggested that the mammal brain is a gland for producing images.
Right.
And we actually think that we're teaching a dog sit, but I think we're sending mind-to-mind transmission, and we're tagging it to a word.
Yeah.
But the animals know.
Get it somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, they're reading the mind.
Yeah.
One of you made me think that there's a phrase in the liturgy which I disagree with every Sunday we do it. It says, your word has never been
Oh, I
silent.
hate that. That's my
has never
least
been what?
favorite.
Your word has never been
I hate
silent.
that too.
It's
I'm
rubbish.
with you. I hate that line. Every time I hear it, I'm just
and,
like, oh, here we go again. I'm
well,
so glad you said that.
Well, cross it out.
So I'm just going to skip it next time.
There's a wonderful meditation from the Middle Ages about Mary, who gives birth to the Word who cannot speak a word. That whole notion of the silent word.
Yeah, right.
The word that erupts out of silence and comes back into silence.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
And-
in a way that picture of standing on the cliff and seeing
Yeah, the little waves.
You know.
Yeah, the little waves.
Um,
In your book, one of the books, I think it was the second one, you talk about just being in the commune and not having TV, not having magazines, not having any of that. And along with that being just like this deep distrust of the government. And I wondered, there's such distrust of the government just on the right. I wonder if there's anything that you learned, in that world that's, helpful for us as we have, it's just a huge failure of trust, it seems, that's going on in the political landscape.
I just wrote an article that's going to be published in Alternet.
Oh, great.
And it's called 4 Prescriptions for an Ailing Democracy.
Yeah.
And I'm always interested in questions that are framed out of public discourse. We don't like to remember that the news media, even the best of it, is part of the establishment consciously.
Right.
And they have a vested interest in keeping the frame of the argument limited. So I actually despair over 4 things that are framed out of all argument.
Yeah.
The first one is you can't have a functioning democracy without clear, objective, trustworthy news. And the reason we don't have that is because the news has a responsibility to deliver profits to the corporate sector. And that contradiction between informing the public and creating a bigger bottom line leads the news to the lowest common denominator. If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
So the first thing I think is that we ought to make the news nonprofit. And we as taxpayers, if we have to repay the corporate sector for the money that they lose, it's critical to democracy to do that. Because this whole dialogue about fake news, we no longer have a commonality that we
That's
can
right.
trust.
Exactly.
And then if we're willing to pay and subsidize the news, we ought to pay for the elections so that the politicians work for us. I don't understand the logic of allowing corporations whose employees can all vote, but to allow a corporation to spend its treasure to influence public policy for the benefit of their stockholders. It's ruinous. And so if we want politicians to serve our real interests, we have to remove them from the responsibility of going with the tin cup.
Yeah, right.
Even Obama got 60% of his money from Wall Street,
Right.
which is why no one went to jail in 2008. And then if you want to have elections, you have to end gerrymandered districts. We have to make election districts kind of like the mean of America. You've got to have the same racial, demographic, political spectrums so that politicians have a vested interest in seeking the center.
Right.
And there was another one that I forgot.
That's good. I thought you did great to remember 3 of them.
Anyway, it's...
You'll think of it in about 10 minutes.
yeah, when I go. But anyway, so yeah, I think that we live in a corporatocracy. And I think that since the Citizens United, which the Supreme Court allowed to pass because they said the money will be transparent, 1 month later they had formed secret sectors that take the money and wash it, so we don't know who's supporting any candidate. And if you actually think about it, the terrifying part is that the 1/10% pays for all the candidates. And so their only responsibility is to get elected, which is synonymous with getting the keys to the public treasury.
Yeah.
And so that they can begin their repaying of their corporate donors with tax law, which is invisible to the public. So the one reason we have Donald Trump is that the chicanery of the Congress, which has been entirely conscripted as a concierge for this sector, finance and corporation, even the best people are forced into unholy choices. When Barbara Boxer had to vote for the F-22 fighter jet, which the Pentagon and the Army didn't want, she had to do it to get the money from their stockholders to fight for women and the environment.
Right.
So we're throwing healthy goldfish into polluted water. So until we take the money out of it, you and I have no recourse. Our voice does not count against people who can write $500,000 checks. And the changing of tax law and the sending of aides into corporate offices to show them how to thread the needle is what has gradually moved the gaps between the haves and the have-nots over the last 35 years. And that anger that's out in the broad, that's what produced Donald Trump.
Exactly. Well, I'm so grateful to have you both here.
Thanks.
We have, I have church. It starts very soon, and they're looking up there upstairs, looking for their watches, wondering where I am. It's been such a blessing to have you both here this week.
you.
Next week, we're having Ellen Clark King. She's the executive pastor at Grace Cathedral. She'll be interviewing Dawn Porter, who will be talking about her documentary film Trapped, which describes the battle to keep abortion safe and legal. One of the subjects of her film, Dr. Willie Parker, will be speaking at Calvary Presbyterian Church on Wednesday, November 15th at 7 o'clock p.m. And the service is upstairs at 11 o'clock. Peter's going to be signing books in the back table. And I wanted to thank you both. It's just been a huge blessing to have you both.
Thank you so much.